And so it became first to go on the 1 yard line. And in 40
In the
of them
Father,
couldn't get
the
it
Son,
in.
and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Holy Spirit, inspire the hearts of your faithful and enkindle in us the fire of our love, the fire of your love, that we might be able to use our minds, our actions, our bodies, everything that is part of our true nature to bring the wisdom of God through us into the world, to bring others back into union with the church, and through being unified with the church, with our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Empower us, Holy Spirit, with your grace. Amen. Amen. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Sorry, Father, you could have said this. I just felt like I should have closed the door. There's the man I was hoping to see. Nice. Okay, so today I thought an apropos topic would be talking about the sex abuse crisis. See, we're of course familiar with this from the early 2000s, Cardinal Law in Boston, with all the news coming out about the several bishops throughout the country having not recorded priests who were suspected of sexual abuse of minors. And as we saw the last couple of weeks, it's obviously something that is not inherent to the priesthood if you're someone who takes the view that this is something that is inherent to the priesthood. So I'm going to talk to you a little about the sex abuse crisis today. Let's see. Now, the information we're sharing from the sex abuse crisis here comes from basically two reports. One, in the early 2000s, after everything came out, the FBI went and did a report on analyzing all of the cases, and the FBI released that report, I think, around 2005. Also, the USCCB also did an internal audit of all of the cases of alleged sexual abuse, and they released a report that came out earlier this year. They spent like 9 years analyzing the data. So so the apologetics information that I'll be sharing today is more or less a synthesis of these two reports, the FBI report and the USCCB internal analysis. But generally when people talk about the sexual abuse crisis, they're trying to make one of three arguments. They're either trying to say that it's celibacy's fault, in which case they're trying to overturn the tradition, like the fact that clerical celibacy has sort of always existed since the time of the apostles. I can address, some of you may have questions on that. I'd be happy to address those in question and answer later at the end. Some people bring this up to say that it's the hierarchy's fault. The hierarchy, mismanaged this, so obviously it's not the church's fault, but it's the hierarchy. We shouldn't have bishops and priests and everything like that, right? And some people say, well, this just goes to show that it's just another example of, the church, obscuring the light of knowledge from humanity and making humanity worse. So these are generally three arguments that we get for people invoking the sexual abuse crisis, to a Catholic. So they're usually either trying to blame celibacy, they're trying to blame the hierarchy, or they're trying to blame the church as a whole institution. So before I get into the specific aspects of the reports here, what would be probably the quickest and easiest way to diffuse this line of attack? Yeah.
We're all humans. We're subject to sin.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. So
and also with our view on reconciliation, the hierarchy didn't necessarily hide it, but we fought bringing people back.
Okay. Right. So probably but you go ahead. Yeah.
It's a pretty big argument of generalization there.
What do you mean a big generalization argument?
Well, I think there's a lot of priests in the world.
Okay.
And I think that only a very, very small percentage of them do this.
Okay.
It's and to say that the nature of priesthood is that would be a large argument.
All right, good. So basically, the two quickest ways here to diffuse this are kind of along the lines of what our two wonderful participants here have said, right? First, probably the quickest way to diffuse this is simply to say, okay, so your problem is sexual abuse, so your problem is sin. That's me too. I've got a problem with sin too. Priests shouldn't be sinning.
But they're human.
Yeah. They're human beings sin, okay, maybe this is a bad sin. I admit that it's a bad sin. But are you saying that the entire church has been wrong since the beginning of time because a few people were stupid in the 1970s? That's one way to argue it. And of course, Richie's argument here is that's a big case of generalization. As we're going to talk about here, both the FBI report and the USCCB internal report both indicate that even if we accept that 100% of accusations are true, priests still have a lower rate. Priests would still have a lower rate of molestation than school teachers. So anyone who would claim that the Catholic Church is wrong because a certain number of priests have been accused of molestation, would also have to admit that statistically your child is more likely to be molested in school. And I don't see anyone saying we shouldn't have schools anymore. So, and but that's the molestation rate is actually higher in public schools than in Catholic schools. So that's another thing I point out. The FBI report indicates that.
Ken,
Yes.
just real quick with that. Catholic schools versus public schools, or the Catholic Church in general versus public schools?
The statistic I just quoted, I don't remember what the actual ratio is, but if it's, the USCCB points out that even if we accept that 100% of accusations are accurate, the priesthood alone, as a profession, would have a lower rate than public schools, than public school teachers.
Okay.
Right? And then if you take Catholic school teachers against public school teachers as a ratio, it's lower amongst Catholic school teachers than amongst public school teachers.
Just a
Yes.
brief question about
Sure.
that, and you don't have to spend much time, but the public school system, are they not able to be sued, such as our church has paid millions and millions of dollars for this problem? I don't think you can sue the public school system. Is that true?
I'm not a legal expert, but you can sue the public school system. Yeah.
I went through a couple of law classes, and it's very, very strange. Any government organization, you basically have to ask them permission to sue them. The U.S. government, you have to ask them to sue them.
Yes.
And then the government can say, no, you're not allowed to sue them.
I thought it
And
was
that's that.
difficult.
You have to ask them permission.
Yeah.
I mean, the two different issues. First is, if there is an assault, well then actually there's a cause of action against that person individually. It's either criminal or going forward on a civil type of matter.
Yeah.
But I think what y'all were starting to get to is whether or not you can hold the organization accountable for the acts of their agents or their employees in the scope of their employment or in the scope of their duties.
Yeah.
So two different pieces.
Okay. I know that if you're working within the public school, most public school there's because most public school teachers are normally unionized, to go after to sue, because it's a corporate entity. If you want to sue an individual teacher or individual school system, you have to sue the whole entity of, I believe.
No,
it's not true.
No, you can sue an individual teacher.
You can.
Right. There would be a civil suit against that teacher, or you going to the authorities and law enforcement on a criminal. Remember, we got two pieces: a criminal and a civil.
Criminal and a civil. Okay. So you're saying on the civil level you can sue.
Right. There can be an individual cause of action against that teacher. There can be a criminal cause by the state against that teacher. But I think that back to our hierarchy issue is whether or not, as they were mentioning earlier, the issue of sovereign immunity, where that sovereign, that state, isn't able to be sued unless they're granting themselves, the ability to be sued.
Yeah. Okay, you want to add?
Yeah, real quick, I think that, at least from my perspective, the hardest thing that I've always had to answer to this is,
Yeah.
okay, we understand the Catholic Church took actions,
Uh-huh.
and other people molest and abuse children also.
Yeah.
But you see them going away in handcuffs, and you never see a priest going away in handcuffs.
Well, that's
What-
not true.
Yeah.
What makes the
Now they
priest
do,
different? That when the church at first took the stance of, we will take care of our priests internally.
Okay, if
That's the hardest
okay,
argument.
if I don't address that in the course of the talk, then please ask me again, because that is something that
That's
I
the
was
toughest
going.
question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think I'll hold off my question
Okay.
because I think you might cover it. If not, I will ask.
Okay, cool. All right. So basically, usually the three responses that I would give to anyone making those arguments. I mean, obviously you have the specific issue of celibacy, hierarchy, and the church. But what I'm going to talk about here is first of all, the USCCB talks about what the culture was like in seminaries during the period of the 60s through the mid-80s and what the causes and effects of that were. The FBI report and the USCCB report both talk about the statistics involving the molestation cases themselves, and then the USCCB report talks about the steps that the Vatican and the bishops took and why they did the steps they did. So, first of all, with regard to the culture in seminaries and in the priesthood ranks themselves from the 60s until the mid-80s. First, we have to begin with Vatican II. One of the issues, so Vatican II is of course from 62 to 65. And one of the things that Vatican II did, for better or for worse, is they changed the emphasis they changed one of the major emphases on education of priests in the seminary. And this was because prior to Vatican II, priests were normally taught that they needed to keep a professional distance from their congregation, and because they were representatives of the church, you didn't want the average layperson having the idea that the church was there to be their friend, the church was there to guide them to salvation, and you as a priest were supposed to maintain a discrete distance and not interact with many lay people on the level, right? So Vatican II changes this and says, we're going to stress enculturation. We want the priests to be out there with the lay people, getting to know their plight, and things like this. And this is a change in seminary education that Vatican II heralds, right? The problem is that Vatican II stresses enculturation at the time that the sexual revolution is starting to crank up. And traditional values are starting to be, challenged seriously on a popular level for the first time really in sort of the modern sense. So so on the one hand you have this sort of Vatican II change to seminary, which coincides with this other social movement that's happening in the US and Europe. So that's one issue. Another issue we see here is during this period of time, the 60s to the mid-60s to the mid-80s, in this 20-year period, there is accompanying this a rapid decrease in the number of priests. It's a rapid decrease in the number of priests during this period, number of people entering the priesthood. So whereas before the Vatican II, before the mid-60s, which Vatican II coincides with, you have a situation where priests are expected to maintain a discrete distance from the people. They're not supposed to enculturate with them. They're supposed to stand, a little bit apart. And also, you have more priests. So, whereas a church like St. John's may have had 3, 4, 5 priests in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, right? So there was a much more community atmosphere amongst the priests, right? If you were a priest and you were having problems, you were living usually with 3 or 4 other priests at least, and you could sort of, check each other's behavior if things were happening. But during this time, there's a rapid decrease in priests to the point where most parishes only now have 1 priest. And a lot of priests are used to living with 3, 4, 5 other priests. Okay.
Very lonely life.
So you end up having this, lesser community suddenly amongst the priesthood, at the same time that enculturation is being stressed, and at the same time that like traditional social values are calling into question the idea of celibacy in the first place. So this rapid decrease in number of priests happens for 4 reasons according to the USCCB report. Number 1, people start to question whether or not clerical celibacy is part of the job of being priest, seriously for the first time on a popular level, right? So lots of people are starting to say for the first time in the mid-1960s on a popular level that, maybe clerical celibacy isn't required. There was big anticipation at Vatican II that the Church may reverse its policy on clerical celibacy, right? And it didn't. And lots of sort of more liberal Catholics were very angry and thought Vatican II sold them out. There were several priests, and there was maybe 15% of, it was under 20%. It was under 20% of priests. I want to say it was under 15, maybe around 10% of priests in the 1960s actually had and were claimed to be anticipating themselves being able to get married. So you had priests during Vatican II. Actually, there were a minority, maybe 10% of priests. That means 90% more, but 10% of priests were sort of reported that they had some kind of relationship that you could consider a girlfriend relationship, because they were anticipating Vatican II changing this time-honored tradition. So there's sort of this mental change in the way a lot of priests viewed the priesthood. Second, during this period of time in the U.S., there was now higher trade-offs to becoming a priest, right? In the 20s, 30s, 40s, even as recently as the 50s, right? The clerical stipend that you got to cover your living expenses was, not that much lower than what the average American was making at their labor job in their own income. So if someone was interested in the priesthood, you weren't taking that much of a financial hit to really pursue the idea of priesthood. If your choice is, I'm interested in the priesthood, well, what's my other option? Well, my other option might be working in a factory. And my standard of living may be roughly the same as the priest down the street. So there's a lot less of a financial disincentive to becoming a priest. Starting in the 1960s, the pay of someone working in the economy became drastically higher than the clerical stipend that most priests received. So there became a disincentive. So even if somebody was seriously interested in the priesthood, you now have a much higher trade-off, right? I'm interested in the priesthood, but my standard of living would be a lot higher if I had a job in the economy. Maybe I'm not called to be a priest, right? So now that's another reason why there's a decrease in priesthood starting in the 70s and going through the mid-80s. A third thing was sort of a cultural thing, mostly because of the socioeconomic changes. A lot of people if you look at movies and popular culture in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, right? You've got movies about Bing Crosby being a priest, and Bing Crosby interacts with doctors and lawyers on their level, And so culturally speaking, a priest, the job of priest was seen as roughly interchangeable with doctor, lawyer, priest, the same thing, right? So if you were a parent and your son said they want to be a priest, it was like your son saying, oh, well, I'm going to be a doctor. Oh, that's great. Or, oh, I'm thinking I might want to be a lawyer. Oh, that's great. Then normally you would, foster that a little bit, just like if your son wants to be a doctor or a lawyer, you prep them to go to law school and things like that. Culturally, that's just how it was. Prior to in the 1960s, this again starts to change because people start questioning the celibacy thing, and people on the popular discourse level start questioning more the values of the church. Yes?
Some of this financial bit, is that directly related to the loss of church-going people?
I think the USCCB, there is a decline in church attendance during this period, which also is reflected in the decrease in the number of people entering the priestly vocation starting in this period of time.
Okay.
There's kind of like a correlation, right? So the USCCB report indicates that there's a correlation here. Presumably there's some kind of a causation between these things. But there's certainly a correlation between this one.
Were there priests actually leaving the priesthood during that time? A growth of that?
Well, in the 70s, there is a growth in priests leaving the priesthood. As a matter of fact, there were never fewer priests. There were never fewer priests as a percentage of population as in 1978. 1978 actually had the lowest priest to population ratio in the U.S. Also in Europe, but yeah. So that there does seem to be an economic factor here. Like as the number of priests are going down, the income of the average American is going up relative to the clerical stipend that covered your basic living expenses. Also, the identity amongst the Catholic immigrant populations in the U.S. changed because in the turn of the 1900s, going up into the 30s and 40s, right? Not a whole lot of a social safety net. If you were an immigrant, your social safety net was your family and the church, right? So there was a high incentive for Catholic immigrants to have a lot of children who might be, the idea being that if you had 7 or 8 children, right, at least 2 or 3 of them might become successful and have stable jobs and could support you in your old age, right? And and if you had 7 or 8 kids, then at least 1 or 2 of them might be priests or nuns. Then you'd have a religious community that would look after you and your family, right? So what happens is that by the time the 60s and 70s roll around, right, you're now talking 2nd, 3rd generation Catholic immigrant populations who are now sort of stably on their feet. A lot of them have been to college at this point. A lot of them have their own stable jobs. There's Social Security and Medicaid and Medicare and welfare and things like this that didn't exist back then. So there's now a lesser incentive to have like lots of kids. And if you're only having 1 or 2 kids, maybe 3 kids, there's now not quite the same incentive to encourage kids to become priests, nuns, whatever, right? So there's also during this period of time, there's also a less emphasis within the family of encouraging kids to become priests, nuns, monks, etc., enter religious vocation. And that's what the USCCB report reflects. There's a decrease in priests during this period of time for those 4 reasons, all sort of happening at the same time. There's fewer people going in, there are also more people leaving. As a matter of fact, as recently as the 1960s, if you were a high school graduate and you did not have a college degree, many religious orders would actually pay your college degree if you had taken a certain vow level. Like if you had passed your novice level, but you hadn't taken perpetual vows yet, they would actually pay for skill training that would be relevant for the vocation. What happened is most religious orders no longer do that, precisely because there were lots of, say, religious orders of nuns who do medical work, right? If you pass the novice level, but you hadn't taken perpetual vows yet, you can still leave if you haven't taken your perpetual vows, but if you pass the novice level for a certain number of years, the order might pay for you to go to nursing school, right? Well, maybe after you get your nursing degree, you may decide all of a sudden you don't want to take your perpetual vows and you'll leave and go get a high-paying nursing job, right? Relatively high-paying nursing job. So there was actually, as recently as the 1970s, most religious orders changed their policy on funding education of people entering the order, because so many people in the 70s would say, join a religious order, and then all of a sudden discover that they hadn't been called in the first place. So now almost all religious orders require that you have completed your education on your own prior to entering the order, unless you've taken perpetual vows. Or taken your perpetual vows, which may take 5, 10, sometimes 15 years, then they might pay for your education, because at that point you can't leave. But that happens. Okay, other things. Okay, and then in the mid-1980s, Pope John Paul II sees this trend, and he institutes a series of seminary reforms. Now, what happened was, because of this, in the USCCB in the 1970s, because of the decrease in the number of priests, in the 70s, the USCCB actually lessened the discernment requirements for people who wanted to become priests. The idea was that before the 1960s, they were like bouncing people from even entering the seminary if you didn't have, you know, the right academic background, because they could be a lot more selective because they had more priests. So because the number of priests is decreasing, at some point in I think it was like 1973 or 74, the USCCB actually tells a lot of diocesan vocations people to sort of ease up a little bit on your requirements for entering the seminary, so that we can try to maybe let people in who maybe like aren't as, you know, academically gifted or aren't as, you know, whatever, in order to enter the priesthood to try to stem the number. Pope John Paul II in the mid-80s doesn't believe this is working, and he actually tightens up once again the seminary requirements. Okay, seminary requirements. So, mid-80s, John Paul II tightens up the seminary requirements and says that no, there are actually very specific things. Your discernment time is longer. You know, you have to have a certain, you know, you have to have a certain understanding prior to entering the seminary of Catholic theology and things like this. The idea was that John Paul looked back at the 70s and was like, oh, we're getting a little unorthodox in what we're teaching, you know.
A little sloppy there.
Yeah.
So at that point, I mean, instead of in the 60s, instead of the Council of Bishops going to tighten up everything,
Yeah.
they went the opposite way, thinking they would have more priests
Yes.
by loosening these
Yes.
things, and it destroyed things. Whereas now with John Paul coming back and saying, no, this is a higher calling,
Yeah.
that the explosion in vocations is gone.
Yeah. So if you look at, so it's kind of interesting, like if you look at, there's a big difference between priests who've been educated in seminaries since 1985, and the way they understand the priesthood and its role, and people who were educated in seminaries between the years of 1962, say, and 1985. Huge difference. Yes.
I just want to make the comment that,
Sure.
because I was in the 70s in the youth group of my church, and just, this is totally true, because a youth minister married the priest,
Yeah.
and he became an Episcopalian priest.
Yeah.
And that affected me till I didn't come back, I'm just saying, to totally buy into the Catholic stuff, until I had kids.
Yeah.
So I'm saying that's what kind of damage, because I thought, that's stupid, he just wanted to get married as a kid, you know,
Yeah.
in my high school years.
Yeah.
I wasn't in Catholic school or anything, and CCD was kind of,
It was
at the
60s,
time,
yeah.
no, at the time though, I'm sure it's much, but it's totally true, I mean, I saw it firsthand, like the,
Yeah. So yeah, so that's sort of the historical context which we're looking at here. Now, what's interesting here is that okay, let's go to the molestation case statistics now. According to the FBI report and the USCCB report corroborates this. 90% of the so-called credible accusations that came out in the early 2000s, of the quote-unquote credible accusations, were made by people who claimed to have been molested sometime between the mid-1960s and the mid-1980s.
Okay.
Right? Now what's interesting is that there have only been, so since 1985, there have only been 5 convictions of priests who have molested people, and the molestation has occurred since 1985. There have only been 5 convictions in U.S. court systems of that.
Were these children or?
I'll get there in a second. All right. So what's interesting here, so another interesting thing about the molestation cases here is that, okay, this gets into the definition of pedophilia. The American Association of Clinical Psychiatrists, hopefully I have that. It's the right association. Hopefully I put all the acronym correctly. But I'm pretty sure it's the AACP. It's whatever the National Association of Clinical Psychiatrists is. It's the national board that certifies the clinical psychiatrists.
Certified nuts.
Right. In order, they define, so the experts here define pedophilia as having sexual relations with a prepubescent. With a prepubescent. Sexual relations with a prepubescent. Now what's interesting here is 99% of the cases of pedophilia are by people who were, at the time, post-pubescent. The people who were claiming that sexual abuse happened when they were post-pubescent. Now, the AACP defines, well, what are you going to say, an act with the same sex between 2 post-pubescents is?
Homosexuality.
Homosexuality. So, only in 1% of the reported accusations were the people who are accusing priests actually meeting the AACP's definition of pedophilia. So only 1%. So, I mean, some people will, like it's splitting hairs, like post-pubescent versus, prepubescent, whatever. I mean, but the AACP does make a difference here between a pedophilia. Pedophilia is sex with a prepubescent, and some form of homosexuality, consensual or not, is sex with a post-pubescence of the same gender. Right? They would say rape is, a non-consensual act of sex between post-pubescents. Right? So 90% of the credible accusations occurred sometime after Vatican II changed the seminary requirements in the USCCB, went along with the Vatican II changes and implemented other things, and before the John Paul II seminary reforms of the mid-1980s.
Do they have a statistic out of that 90% of how many of the priests that were involved were actually in the seminary or interns, or were they priests from before?
That's a good question. I'd have to go back and read the reports again.
Because it almost seems like after Vatican II, the filter went away. He opened up the holes in the strainer bigger to let more in. So I don't want to say the bad elements, but not as good.
And then, it's also possible that if you had people like, say, in the system prior to the Vatican II reforms, you may have had people who, didn't do anything prior because there was a lot more oversight, and all of a sudden the filter's gone. Oh, well.
Cool, I could run crazy.
Yeah. So that's another possibility. Yes.
When all this was going down, I found it interesting in most of these cases that people were accusing priests. A lot of the priests were already dead. They were so they couldn't defend themselves.
Yeah. Yep. So the interesting stat here is that, there have been, since 1985, there have only been 5 convictions in which the priests had molested somebody since 85. All of the other cases all the other conviction cases were people during this period of time that molested somebody during this period of time. Okay, so the Vatican and bishops' response. This one is actually kind of a little bit interesting. All right, number 1. Okay, I'm just going to draw an arrow here. All right, so issue number one here with the USCCB response is that another thing that Vatican II did was that Vatican II tried to increase the amount of subsidiarity, right? Because Vatican I had said that the Pope was the universal ordinary of the Church, which meant that the Pope was the bishop, technically was the bishop everywhere at the same time, and then, your local bishop was really just there to, be a mirror image of the Pope. Vatican II said, while that's true, we want to give the local diocese much more administrative control than they had between Vatican I and the 1960s. So, Vatican II administratively, it empowers local bishops to be the determining authority on administrative issues, and in order for the Vatican to get involved in an administrative issue in your local diocese, the local bishop has to kick it up the floor, has to kick it upstairs, right? The only exception is, if the Vatican is going to investigate the bishop himself, right? The Vatican can investigate the bishop himself at any time, right? But anything that goes below the level of the local bishop is the determining authority unless he specifically calls up the Vatican and says, I need you to handle this. So, one of the things that came out was that local bishops, so if you are suspecting that if you have suspicions that a priest might be molesting somebody, who are you supposed to report to?
Just the local bishop.
The local bishop, okay. And who's supposed to handle this?
The
Local bishop. What happened, and does the Vatican know anything about this if the local bishop doesn't tell them anything? No. Okay. So, what happens if the local bishop doesn't want to appear like a weak or poor administrator to the Vatican? Don't you gonna say anything? Okay. So, local bishops often refuse to act on accusations, especially during this period of time, for 3 reasons according to the USCCB report. Even though it was their prerogative to act, they had all of the Vatican empowerment to act and often chose not to. There are 3 reasons. Anybody want to guess?
The fewer priests being in the thing, they didn't want to remove any.
Okay, manpower, right? You got fewer priests in the system? Okay, that guy obviously can't work in that environment anymore. We'll just move him to another environment where he's going to, not have a similar temptation, right? So they would often take people and say, okay, I'm sorry, people suspect you of something, reports have come back to me. I'm going to move you out of, say, working in a parish, and, we'll have you staff the diocesan library. You'll go and do, research on theological stuff over in that library somewhere, right? They would sort of reassign them to do other tasks. They may reassign them to the diocesan office so the bishop can, watch them. So there were several cases where they actually, on paper, priests who were suspected things got promotions because they were moving them in-house so the bishop could keep an eye on them more closely. But this is often reported in the New York Times, say, as, gets a promotion for molesting kids.
Because he works on the bishop's staff.
Yes, yeah.
So both in the FBI and the USCCB, did they talk about, because I haven't seen those reports, but do they talk about when there's the allegation, whether or not there was criminal investigation? Did the folks go to the police?
Well, the FBI report doesn't disclose specifics of cases. What they do say is that, this is the general information. There were so-and-so, there were such and such, there were this many accusations, this many obtained convictions, this many were dismissed, right? This many we were not allowed to act on because of other things.
Such as settlements?
Such as settlements, or such as diplomatic immunity.
Okay.
I'll explain the diplomatic immunity thing in a second. So one issue is manpower. The other was lots of bishops at this time feared bad press, right? So even if you haul in a priest and you punish him in accordance with suspicion, what's page 1 of the local city paper going to read, right? Most bishops were like, well, yes, I should punish him, but really the bad press might be worse, so I'll just reassign him. Everything will stay quiet. I'll put him in a position where he won't be in a position to molest anybody. So, bad press. That was another reason the USCCB report cites. Also, in the 70s and 80s, therapy was big. As a matter of fact, people actually, the AACP at the time, in the 70s and 80s, actually openly taught to clinical psychiatrists that things like molestation could be cured by going through enough psychotherapy and discovering the thing that was like in your past that you could confront it. If you confronted it, then you wouldn't be molest people anymore, right? So lots of times they weren't punished, but the bishops required priests with suspicion to go through psychotherapy. And then they'd be like, oh, psychotherapy, you're now cured, congratulations. Because we discovered, this. Because we discovered you were dropping your head as a child, that's why you molested those people before. Congratulations, you now know that. You're no longer molestable, right? So, therapy was a big thing at this time. Yes?
So it was the bishops who actually convinced the psychiatrist of this?
No. It was a prevailing amongst clinical psychologists and psychiatrists.
I thought so.
This was like a prevailing teaching. So like when the bishops are trying to deal with, we have people who are being accused of molestation. Well, who am I going to look to? Maybe experts on psychiatry.
Okay,
who are
that's
telling me
what
this.
I thought.
Yeah.
So-
That was the time when Eric Bernie's I'm okay, you're okay. I mean, there's a whole plethora in culture.
Yeah. Yes.
I have someone in my life right now that she's very liberal, and she tells me that the one thing about the Catholic Church that really ticks her off is that they take proven priests that have molested children and take them from one parish and put them in another. And she said that's why
there
would they
are
do that?
very few cases in which that actually happened. In other words, the only times when someone who was, let's put it this way, there are virtually, I'm going to say virtually just because I don't have the report in front of me, but to my recollection, there are no cases in which a bishop had definitive evidence that someone had done something and then reassigned them to a situation similar to what their situation was. Right? There were times in which bishops were given evidence, local bishops were given evidence, and then some of them, once given evidence, would quietly turn over the police. But oftentimes, the normative thing the bishop would do is be like, okay, I have evidence, I'm going to put you somewhere where you're not going to interact with very many people. Right? That would happen, but very rarely were bishops presented with definitive evidence. Usually what the bishops were dealing with was other priests saying, I suspect that this guy might be doing something, but I don't have any proof. Or lay people that were considered credible were saying, I have a suspicion. And then the bishop is acting on suspicions of credible people, but not having a lot of information. There are very, very few cases in which bishops were given definitive evidence, period. But in the very few cases where they were given definitive evidence, they were almost never reassigned to a similar situation. Yes?
I think what happened was that was a lot of times what you hear in society is a bad press thing.
Yeah.
Because let's say this priest, when it all came out, they found out that he was there was evidence that he was molesting somebody over here in this parish.
Yeah.
But the diocese didn't know about it.
Yeah.
Now diocese had to transfer him because we were losing priests, so they had to put him somewhere else.
Yeah.
He had too many priests here, we'll move him over here.
Yeah.
Well, now he's doing the same thing over here.
Yeah.
That's when they found out. So basically the press came out and said, well, the church knew about it here, they transferred him somewhere else.
Yeah.
The church didn't know about it when they transferred him. So it was just Bad timing and
there
bad
are also
press.
cases like that.
Yeah, bad timing, bad press.
Yes.
So in Vatican II, when it empowered the bishop on this administrative issue, did it empower them to also have investigative powers to be able to go, to look into those allegations?
It basically says, on any administrative issue, the local bishop is the final authority.
So they were able to conduct investigation?
Yeah, they could if they wanted, they could do, whatever they wanted.
And then some were turned over to police if that was what they found? Or what about the laity? I mean, how are they involved? Didn't they go to the police?
Very rarely at this period of time did lay people go to the police. And there are a couple of theories on that. Number one is who wants to go to the police and say, oh, because the idea that very few people actually want to admit molestation in the first place. Right. So, and some people think it just happened to me. I'm the only case. I'm the exception. Why am I gonna talk? Why am I gonna accuse that priest? I'm the only one. Then once other people start coming out, they then come out. That's one theory. The other theory is that at the time, even in the 1960s, right, there was still a very intra-Catholic understanding of the church community, right? Because, like, when immigrants came in, right? I mean, if you had, even if you had a poor administrative priest or something like that, you would very rarely report a priest that you thought was doing something bad, even if it wasn't like sexual molestation. If it was like you thought he was a bad administrator, you thought he was unorthodox, something like that, you often wouldn't report that because you wouldn't want to be the person that hurt the church administratively when it was trying to care for such a large immigrant population, right? And don't forget, as recently as the 1960s, you had lots of Protestants saying that Kennedy should not have been elected president because he was an evil blood-sucking papist, right? So very few Catholics want to go public or go to the police and say, I think my parish priest is doing this, because you're like, well, what are the consequences? That's just another thing that Protestants are going to hold against Catholics, right? You know. No,
Which is, I think, a lot of the press bias too.
Yeah. Another issue with regard to the local bishops and Vatican response, the other issue is the issue of the diplomatic immunity issue. And this is that under canon law, a priest cannot be tried in a secular court without the express permission of the Pope. So you have to get, in order for a priest to be tried in a secular court under the Catholic Code of Canon Law, you definitely have to get the Pope's approval for this. And if the Pope hasn't issued like a blanket approval that it's okay for any local bishop in this area to turn him over at his inclination, then the local bishop, if he wants to turn someone over to the police, has to call up Rome and try to get Rome to get a response on this one particular case. So, diplomatic immunity issue, under Catholic Code of Canon Law, priests are not allowed to be tried in secular courts, they're only allowed to be tried in ecclesiastical courts.
That goes to what I was talking about with right there. And we, in American society, anytime a diplomat or diplomat's family does a crime and says it has a bad stigma.
And one of the issues here is that in the 80s, one of the things like more liberal Catholics will they'll say John Paul II centralized the church, and it was such a bad thing. He reasserted Vatican. Well, in the mid-1980s, John Paul II also said, okay, as Pope, I am now instructing any local bishop, if any local bishop now has the authority to turn over anybody, if they have credible enough evidence, they're supposed to turn them over to the secular authorities. Pope John Paul II doesn't have a problem with that. So one of the things Pope John Paul II does is he says, any local bishop, if you have a problem, it's your prerogative, but you have the authority to turn them over to, if you think the accusations are credible. If the accusations are not credible, you don't have a right to turn a priest over to a secular court. But John Paul II says, that's fine. If you have credible enough evidence, you can turn the priest over to a secular court. So that doesn't happen until 85. Third issue is something that, so people say the Vatican's response was slow.
It only seems slow because they didn't know about it.
Yeah, so number one, they didn't know a lot about it. They didn't know a lot of stuff until, say, they read the New York Times in 2002, right? But by all accounts, most officials in the Vatican were like, this is obviously, we haven't heard anything about this. This is obviously, you know, anti-Catholic bias from the New York Times and the Boston Globe and things like this. We haven't heard about this before. Surely the local bishops would have told us if this were a big enough problem. Right. The other issue is that Pope John Paul II had a lot of experience with this, and that's in communist countries, especially Catholic, communist countries in which there were a lot of Catholics. The communists would often trump up charges against priests as a way of trying to break the spirit of the community. For example, in Poland, it was very common for the Soviet authorities to, you know, if you were a priest working with the underground, which John Paul II used to be one, it was very common for the communist authorities to say, people of Poland, you should not trust the following priests. Why? And then they would, you know, trump up some kind of really nasty charge. There were sometimes where the communists would be like, your priest is a cannibal, you know, don't listen to your priest, you know, your priest, and they would often use pedophile. They would often use pedophile as a way of trying to get the people to distrust their local clergy, so that they would be more inclined to report things to the communist authorities. Very common in Poland. So it took John Paul II a long time, once he was actually like confronted with the information, to actually believe that this was not just like anti-Catholic bias, a la what he personally experienced in Poland with the communists in charge. Ironic. So I want to say it's kind of ironic is that the same week that the cardinal law story broke, Beijing, the Communist Party in China, all of a sudden discovered that they had 70 underground pedophile priests that they executed. So the Communist Party in China actually used the breaking of this story in the U.S. as cover for launching a persecution of Christians in China. And then the idea being that, like, well, if the U.S. diplomats complain about us persecuting Christians now, we can always say, look, we've got the same problem you did. Look at all the pedophile priests we found this week. Right? And that was the Chinese had, the Vatican had regular experience with the Chinese doing this even before the 2000s. John Paul had experience with the communists doing this in Poland. The Soviets did that in Lithuania too. They would try to find out which priests had the biggest followings in, like, against the regime, and then they would try to discredit the priest who had a large following by claiming, for example, that he was a pedophile, even if it wasn't true. So, and especially if it wasn't true. Yes.
I think our news people and that are persecuting the very Catholic Church, because a lot of these people who are brought up into the claim they were molested were all older people. They were people that they dragged in off the street, and it would seem like it was every day another one was appearing.
Yeah, and I certainly don't want to say that, you know, none of those are legitimate, of course. Like, a certain number of those are like, you know, legitimate molestation
but
cases.
I think a certain number of them weren't also.
I mean, it's possible, yeah.
And this goes back to the therapy.
Yeah.
Was it proven, the amount of the priests that have done this, was it proven that they actually had something going on in their life prior, like that they were molested, for instance, by their parents? Because back then in the 60s through the 80s, it was kept quiet.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly don't know off the top of my head. I don't think they addressed that in the report. But
if they were affected by
but yeah, I mean, regardless. Yeah,
but Freud and Jung, I mean, that was the big thing, that always it was your parents did this or that. It was making sure you were not responsible for your action. That was what the popular culture was.
Yeah.
I mean, there was like a certain consensus amongst psychologists and psychiatrists at this time about what you were supposed to do in certain cases. Yeah.
And I don't know if you really said, but I think it was a much higher incidence of homosexuality than children, right, correct?
Oh, yeah, yeah,
So-
again, like, yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so one of the issues here is that one of the big issues is that most of the accusators are same-sex post-pubescent, right? There are very few women who have claimed to be molested by priests, right? 1% of the cases are same-sex pedophilia. 99% are post-pubescent, there's post-pubescent, and then the vast majority of, it's like the overwhelming majority, I forget what the exact percentage is, but the overwhelming majority of the post-pubescent cases are post-pubescent same-sex. So the issue here is, it's almost entirely it's almost entirely a homosexuality issue rather than a pedophilia issue.
Which is probably the same standard as in the rest of the population.
Yeah. So one of the things I'd point out is, well, according to the statistics, the problem is homosexuality. I have a problem with homosexuality too. Do you have a problem with homosexuality?
Ken, it's interesting. Our church really needs to find a spokesperson in all the local dioceses to stand up and talk about this, because what the media does, they never mention the word homosexuality. It's always called pedophilia. They never, ever deviate off of that. And it's something that I've argued with someone before, and so I'm glad that you brought that up. But the other thing is, the spokesperson for this problem is always the lawyer that represents the victims, and the media gives the microphone to the lawyer, and then he's the spokesperson for everyone, and it drives me just bonkers.
Just one of the big issues is that the church at the same time, the church doesn't want to seem like it's running too much of an offense, because at the same time, the church doesn't want to. Most bishops in the USCCB, right, they don't want to come off as being insensitive to the people who were legitimately molested, right? So what they do is they release reports like this. They have people in the Catholic Standard will write articles on this for people who read the Catholic Standard and their diocesan newspapers.
I understand what you're saying, but I do think it's time that we do put up a defense for ourselves. Again, we as Catholics, a lot of us, like Catherine said, have had to live through these things, and a lot of us did not waver from the faith, but it was an embarrassing time and a difficult time for us, and it's just interesting when we as individuals say, don't you see homosexuality in this issue? And what's thrown back to us as a defender is, oh, but your priest also ran those orphanages where they molested all the deaf and blind orphan kids. And I'm like, okay, I don't know about that one. I'll have to research that one. Oh, so you hear I've had to fight it a few times. And
When was the USCCB report?
They began launching their internal probe about a year or so after the Cardinal Law story broke in 2002, and they just released the report last year, I think.
It's on their website.
It should be on their website. I mean, I actually got the report because I got an email from the Catholic League and Bill Donahue and Raymond Arroyo, and they actually emailed the report out to everyone's on the email list. So that's how I got the report. But I would imagine the USCCB would have it on their website. Yeah.
This is looking at abuses in the U.S., but are there similar abuses or statistics in Europe?
Ireland's going through it right now. I haven't looked at the Irish statistics. I would venture to say that I would imagine if you looked at the Irish statistics, it would probably be very similar to this.
The same sort of culture, and of course they were affected by Vatican II as we were.
Yeah, I mean, Vatican II had an omnipresent effect.
Well, it's important to prove that celibacy doesn't cause pedophilia too. It's not related at all.
It's not
people that they're so deprived, they have to,
No, I mean.
There's no proof in that at all.
Yeah, I mean, when someone says that, you just have to be like, okay, look. I can name at least 15 saints off the top of my head who managed to successfully live this lifestyle. I can name, this problem is so not prevalent that I have like actually never even met a priest that had a problem with the the celibacy issue. So it's it's just I would just point out the vast majority of priests over the vast majority of the history of the church were able to successfully practice celibacy. The only reason why it seems so difficult now is because of the prevailing culture.
And probably there's a greater number that might have left the priesthood for heterosexual, because it's, I don't know. I mean, that's probably a different statistic, but.
Yeah. I think you had your hand up first,
The statistics you're pointing out, are they just from the USCCB, where the report that said that there's a higher percentage in the school system versus the Catholic Church? Because some people might not think that the USCCB is credible.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty sure that was in the FBI report.
Okay.
But even if you don't look at the FBI report, I'm sure that I'm sure someone's publishing those statistics. I know.
Other than
because I'm pretty sure. I mean, most public institutions would have to publish,
they try
their legal
to quiet
cases.
it up unless it gets blamed.
Yeah.
Going back to the celibacy thing.
Sure.
If there was a problem with celibacy, wouldn't there be a lot less same-sex kind of stuff? If there was a problem with celibacy,
I agree.
because if there was a problem with celibacy, wouldn't there be a lot less homosexuality on it?
What do you mean?
Be a lot of women coming out.
Oh yes, yeah, okay. Oh, with regard to who was reporting the instances, yes. You would think that if celibacy were the problem, a higher percentage of the cases would involve women, right? But very few of them are. I think I don't want to quote the stat off the top of my head just because I didn't remember and I didn't write it down. But it's the vast minority of the cases. None of the pedophilia cases actually involve women, and very few of the post-pubescent cases, the non-pedophilia cases, involve women. Yes.
Do we have class next week? And if so, what's our topic?
Okay, we will not have class next week because I will be coming back from Kennedy. We will have class the following week. The topic I was planning was apologetics for Catholic theology of the body and sexual ethics, since that would sort of piggyback off the sexual